The fifth principle of movement, support. So I'm on page 90 in your manual. Whatever part of the body that touches the ground becomes the structural base of support. This base dictates what the rest of the body can or cannot do. When support is lacking in the base of movements, the structures higher up compensate by supporting rather than being supported. So when the hands, feet, sitting bones, elbows, or head make contact with the ground, it is essential that we distribute the weight of the body evenly through this base. Equal base distribution creates equal distribution of stress, both in the contracting surface and in the structure supporting above the base. Imagine what it would like to be to wear a pair of shoes, and this is the analogy I give you, that has one high heel and then one shoe that has no heel, right? You'd be walking uneven. And then all of a sudden, after a couple of days of doing that, your body starts to compensate and it starts to run up the whole body. You start to get pains because your muscles try to hold you up. Our body, as we learned in class, is always in a state of homeostasis. It wants to support you. It doesn't want you to fall. And so when we're not evenly distributed, there's something that's going to work a little harder than something else. So something's compensated for a lack of support somewhere else. And so when we talk about this support in the body, we really have to think about wrapping the body or the muscles around the bones that we'll talk about in a moment, that you need to learn and memorize. But we are also going to talk about the muscles that are wrapping around the bones, either internally or externally. So as we go on into this terminology of this principles of movement, I'm going to turn to page 92. This is really important for us to start to understand. We need to learn these terms, medial and lateral. Medial means towards the midline. Lateral means away from the midline. Then we have proximal and distal. So proximal and distal, are kind of like distance-wise. So I could say something like, so everyone knows your sternum is here, right? And this is the midline of the body. So I'm going to pick my sternum. My shoulder is proximal to my sternum. But if I extend my hand and my arm out to the side, my fingers are distal to my sternum. They're farther away. My shoulder's proximal, it's closer, right? It's closer towards the midline. My fingers are distal, they're farther away. Superior and inferior. Superior is always towards the head. Inferior is always towards or away from the head. Anterior, posterior. Anterior is the front of the body. Posterior is the back of the body. Ventral, dorsal. Ventral is on the front. Dorsal is on the back. Superficial and deep. So superficial is something that comes up towards the skin. So when I start working and I start to get my chaturangas and I start to do a vinyasa practice, you see quickly how the muscles respond to the work, and you'll see definition in your muscle structure. The muscles start to pop up towards the skin. Muscles are superficial. But yoga also works deep, which is the opposite of superficial. It works my organs, right? I can work deep into my nervous system. I could work deep into my energy system, things that I can't see. So on page 92, there's also examples of that. Please go through that. It'll help you tremendously. On page 93, we start talking about the human skeleton. And so I will send you pictures of Fred. We call our skeleton Fred. And you have to learn certain bones of Fred. Understand that bone are living dynamic tissue that forms the body's framework, the structural framework. It is our frame of our house. Our bones is a connective tissue in which hard matrix is created by the deposition of calcium phosphates and other minerals, as well as cells and blood vessels. This combination gives bones a tensile strength near that of steel, but it maintains a modicum of elasticity. So we've already talked about these two terms that I'd like you to learn, Sthira Sukha Asana, Our bones are a perfect example of Sthira Sukhasana. Our bones are strong like steel. They'll hold up a 700-pound person, but yet they have this modicum of elasticity because they're constantly changing. They're constantly rebuilding themselves. They're constantly moving. They're not a static object. A regular practice of yoga is beneficial for your bones because healthy stresses are applied in a variety of unusual directions, and this strengthens the bones. The bones like to have compression on them. It helps them get dense and helps them build their strength. So another exercise that's a natural, wonderful exercise to build bone density is to walk every day. Walk, yoga, these things will help build our bones. So what's the disease that produces bone mass decrease? Think about that. Yes, osteoporosis. Osteoporosis is when the bones become porous and brittle because they lack density. Now, they also could be lacking calcium. Our bones are where our calcium is stored, and when we don't get it from our foods, or we don't get it from the sunshine, the body will leach the calcium from the bones itself. It'll get it, right? And so what does that mean? That means that our bones become a little porous because it doesn't have a calcium matrix. So be very mindful of what we're putting into the body to protect our bones, how we're using our physical exercise to strengthen our bones, and how are we going out in the sunshine to get that wonderful vitamin D. On page 93, it also is talking a little bit about the shapes of the bones. We have long bones, flat bones, short bones. We have all different kinds of bones. And I want you to think about examples of bones. What's a long bone? Yes, our humerus is a long bone. Our femur is also a long bone. Short bones, my phalanges, my vertebrae. Right? Flat bone, my sternum. On page 94, we talk about what the word asana means. Asana means comfortable position or comfortable seat. So again, Sthira Sukha. Remember that term. Sthira Sukha. On page 95, we have the fundamental bones that you need to learn. We will go through Fred in class, and I'll give you a bunch of different blank copies so that you can memorize. This is a very easeful list on page 95. We have the clavicle. I'll go through the list. Scapula, sternum, humerus, radius, ulna, ilium, sacrum, pubis, femur, patella, fibula, tibia, phalanges, metacarpals, carpals, tibial tuberosity, ankle and hindfoot, which is the calcaneus and the talus, the midfoot, the tarsals, and the forefoot, the metatarsals. We will go all over that almost every day after that, okay? I also want to talk a little bit about something that might confuse some people. Now, you hear me say it all the time. I'll say, your axial skeleton, I want you to feel how your axial skeleton is moving. Some people have no idea what that is. So, on page 96, it's an explanation of what the axial and the appendicular skeleton is. Our axial skeleton is our skull, our vertebral column, our rib cage, and our sternum. That is our axial skeleton. That, my loves, it's what all yoga poses surround themselves around. So, this is the most important part of our body. It's our brain, our spinal column or our spinal cord, and our vital organs. This is my axial skeleton. This is the most vital part of me. There are some people, unfortunately, that are born without arms and without legs, and they can survive. So when we use our arms and our legs in yoga practice, it's like a plus. So we can actually touch the space. Be grounded into the floor. So that's our axial skeleton. My appendicular skeleton is my shoulder girdle and my arms, and my pelvic girdle and my legs. Both of them attach themselves to the spine. And we'll talk more about that in class. So on page 97, there's a picture of the axial and appendicular skeletons. On page 98, there's more a comparison between a male and female skeleton. We know women have a broader base in their hips. Our center of gravity is a little lower than men, right? And so we could have a little wider base. It could sometimes our knees knock together because of that. So there's a lot of differentiations between women's hips and men's hips. So there's a nice little diagram on page 98. So throughout this fifth principle of movement, you'll see all the bones in their entirety separate. Please go through that, and we will learn Fred as a whole. So on page 108, we also start to talk about the joint. So a joint is where two bones meet. You need to know that, and you need to know what connects these bones. Ligaments connect the bone. Ligament connects bone to bone. And in our studies, we're going to learn simple things like we're going to talk about the ball and socket joint, and we're going to talk about a hinge joint. So the ball and socket joint is my shoulder and my hip. The hinge joint are my knees and my elbows. Fingers too, right? So understand what's a hinge joint and what's a ball and socket joint. And that's on page 108. We also start talking about synovial fluid, how the synovial fluid goes into the joints to help us move around smoothly. And we get that through imbibition by movement. It also clears the joint space of debris, and it keeps us healthy. On page 108, we talk a little bit about joint reaction forces, understanding that the example I give you in class is that when we start to move into space, we have to understand what has the greatest joint reaction force. So if I'm going to come into tree or Ardha Baddha Padmottanasana, I have to understand that it is a hip opener. It's a hip movement. It's not a knee movement. So this ball and socket will confer the greatest weight than the hinge joint. And we'll talk a lot about that in class to keep us safe in our yoga practice. So on page 110, we have types of joints, right? On page 111, we go individually through the shoulders and hips. On page 112, I talk a little bit about the ligaments here and what they do. We talk about the shoulder ligaments, the hip ligaments, and the knee ligaments. Okay. On page 114 is a complete review of the bones, the ligaments, and the skeleton. Please go through that. Also on page 115 is the continuation of that review. On page 116, we start talking about muscles and tendons. Now, we already talked about the bones and how they meet at the joint, and the ligaments connect bone to bone. Now we're going to go a step further and slap some muscles on them. The muscles are what moves the bones. The bones don't move on their own. The muscles will move the bones in all different directions, right? And so on page 116 is going to be your introduction to our movement of the musculoskeletal system. Every muscle has a different shape and it has a different function. What you do need to learn here is these terms: origin, insertion, agonist, antagonist. Right? So we really are going to talk a lot about agonist and antagonist. We'll also talk a little bit about synergists. So the agonist is going to be your prime mover. The antagonist is going to be the movement that's doing the opposite, the muscle that's doing the opposite movement. So the examples that I give are, if I do a bicep curl, my bicep is contracting as my tricep is lengthening. Agonist, antagonist. And this happens in all different relationships in the body. Remember that as we start going forward into our terminology speak, when you start layering that on top of your teaching. Tendons attach muscle to the bone. Please don't tell me that ligaments attach them. Tendons are the end part of your muscle. right? And they attach to the bone. Muscles come in a variety of shape depending on what they're doing. So on page 117, we start talking about how the muscles move in different planes. So here we have the coronal plane, the sagittal plane, and the transverse plane. These are the ways that the muscles will move the bones around. So the coronal plane is going to divide you from front and back. And this is going to be our adduction and abduction. Adduction is bringing in towards the midline. Abduction is going away from the midline. That's in our coronal or frontal plane. The sagittal plane is going to divide the body into right and left halves. This is flexion and extension. These bring us into flexion and extension. The transverse or the horizontal plane cuts us right in the center, right where our waist is, and we rotate. We rotate. On any joint, we rotate. Okay? Internal or external rotation. On page 118, we have Frank, our muscle guy. And we will go over all the muscles that you need to learn on Frank. We'll also go through with the magic markers, and we'll start to mark each other, marking where, so that I know that you know where the tricep is, where the bicep is, where your pec minor, where your pec major is, where it's located. And so you will get a list of the muscles that I want you to start to investigate. And of course, we're going to go over them. Okay, so if we keep going on to this chapter, and this is a long chapter, and I know it is, so I give you a little bit more time. On page 123 is this whole cheat sheet for your basic terminology of an anatomy. And so we, in yoga, we don't need to learn the whole Gray's anatomy, but you do need to learn these terms. These terms are going to help you immensely when you start teaching in your studios. And that goes all the way to 125. Yeah. Here's another cheat sheet for the body movements on 127. And here's a list of muscles on 128, 129. Or your list of muscles. It's a long chapter, and we're going to take a long time on it. So don't be afraid to ask questions about movement, especially the physical body, the physical sciencey kind of anatomy. I'm going to try to keep it as simple as possible, and I think that you'll benefit from it being as simple as we keep it. If you have any questions about it, write it down and bring it to class tomorrow.